morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you all so much for coming to join us today. We're welcoming you to Nantucket's second annual Climate Change Summit. And today we're really focusing on adapting Nantucket and thinking about climate change and how we are responding to change around us. Now, this summit has been organized by staff at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation and the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, with support from the Community Foundation for Nantucket, Remain Nantucket Fund, as well as Great Harbor Yacht Club, where we are right now. We wanted to introduce ourselves, even though I'm sure we have been in a room with a lot of you before. I am Dr. Jen Carberg. I work for the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, and I'm the Director of Research and Partnerships. I'm also a wetland coastal ecologist, which pulls me very strongly into the climate change realm. And with me is my colleague.
Sorry, we're sharing the mic. So welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Sarah Boyce. I'm the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. I'm also an ecologist, but not a wetland specialist. And Jen and I have been doing a lot of communicating about climate change, resiliency around the island for years. And I'm really excited about today's summit because, as Jen mentioned, as we move towards talking about adaptation and where we are now and where we are into the future, it's really like a next step for us in our evolution of this type of climate change conversation. And so if you've heard some of our talks before, or if you've been to last year's summit, a lot of what we talked about initially is where we're at in terms of the data. What are the temperature changes and the seasonality changes that we are currently seeing or are projected to be seen? We talk about precipitation, ocean warming, and then the impacts of these climate change effects. Storminess and flooding, ocean acidification, erosion, sea level rise, flooding, groundwater rise and flooding, changing plant and wildlife ranges, as well as changing phenologies. And we're not going to go into detail about this tonight, but if you are interested in some of our takes on this and some more of the detailed information we have for Nantucket, we encourage you to either click on this QR code, Scan it with your phone. You can open your camera, or go to ACKclimatesummit.org, where recordings of previous talks we gave last winter are available that have some more of this detailed information. But tonight we're going to focus more on the adaptations that these climate change effects, or that are responses to these climate change effects.
So why this climate change summit? In the past, as Sarah said, and as you can see on our previous website and talks and things that we've done before, climate change is a reality and is something that is happening around the world, but also right here in our own backyards. And we're seeing the effects of change just in the last 5, 10, even 15 years. For those of you that have been on island for a little while, you can see change happening. But often when you go to the media or you listen to talks about climate change, it's doom and gloom and extreme. This is often what you're hearing, is that we've got increased storms, wildfires, droughts, flooding. Here on Nantucket, we've got massive winter storms that bring flooding. We've got erosion that's happening. Those are kind of the two big: sea level rise and flooding, and then erosion are our two big dramatic impacts on the island. But this is a lot of kind of doom and gloom. Where's the hope in this? What can we do as a community? And so this is really why we started doing the Climate Change Summit last year and wanted to continue it this year, is because we can't, as a community, keep living in a sense of fear. We need to move towards that hope. And what can we do? And what can I do within my own backyard, within my job? How am I already changing? And thinking about that adaptation that's happening. One of the things we wanted to point out is that there's already adaptation and changes happening on island, whether it's purposeful towards thinking about climate change, but we live in an island that's very dynamic. And so as Nantucketers, we're often changing, we're often adapting to what's around us. The picture on the far side is just down the road here, and that is a native plant garden that's been installed in an area that occasionally floods and has been designed in a way that is adapted to the change that they're seeing in their front yard. The house on the corner here, I wouldn't say they necessarily said, well, climate change is coming, so we're going to put this house on stilts. It was an adaptation to change that was happening around them, driven by climate change impacts. And then if you walk out to our working waterfront, Nantucket has been adapting to the climate and the environment around us for a very long time. We've built areas out into our harbor because that's where we wanted buildings and places to be, and we figured out how to do that adaptation. So what I'm trying to get to is that Nantucket is and has already adapted to change. And starting to learn about what those adaptations are, how other people within our community are starting to adapt, it kind of gives us hope and a direction for what that future community adaptation might be. And then as we're diving into the rest of our little introduction that Sarah and I are going to do, I need to give you some definitions because I keep talking about adaptation, but what is that? What are we really talking about today? Basic adaptation is adjustment in response to current or future effects of climate change, whether that's adjustment of infrastructure, adjustment of work policies, adjustment of farming practices. There's a lot of ways that we'll have to adjust to change. There's natural adaptation and there's intentional adaptation. And a lot of us are doing and observing some of this already. Sarah's going to talk a little bit about natural adaptation, which is the adjusting of ecosystems, individuals, species, to what's changing around them, temperature, precipitation timing, things that are already happening in nature around us. And then there's intentional adaptation, the adaptation that we as individuals, as community members, are taking ourselves to respond to change, whether we're raising roadways or moving houses, whether we're adjusting our work hours because it's too hot in the middle of the day to be outside. There's all sorts of adjustment that we might be making.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen. And so when we talk about that natural adaptation, how our flora and fauna and our ecosystems as a whole are responding to those environmental stimuli, we're just going to give a few examples of what we're seeing here in Nantucket. And one of the big changes that we're seeing are changes in the growing season. Now that includes the length of the growing season overall, the onset of the growing season, how early it is, and maybe extending, as we said, into the fall. And so one of the things that we are looking at is how our native species are adapting to these changes in the growing season. At the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, one of our longer-term research projects is looking at our phenological responses of our native shrubs. And when I say phenology, it's just the timing and what the plants, in this case plants, are doing. And so, for example, we're looking at the leafing out in the spring. So it's like the first thing a plant does, and it's responding to those warming temperatures. Is that also tracking those earlier temperatures? We're looking at flowering and fruiting for these species. And what the quick take home of this and what we're finding so far is that our species, our communities aren't responding as a whole. So it's not like all of the sandplain grasslands or all of the heathlands are, leafing out earlier or flowering earlier. Each individual species is having an individualized response to those environmental stimuli. And so understanding more about how that's changing now helps us think about how these communities will change in the future. And this little blueberry plant that's on the right-hand side is a flowering plant that was flowering in November a few years ago. So there's adaptation to the long-term changes, but then there's also these episodic events as plants are kind of tracking weird temperatures too. And then, of course, with the changing growing season, we're also looking at our gardens. We're going to hear more from Julie Jordan later today about landscapes and gardening. But I think about my home garden, what I'm planting, what we want to eat, our landscapes, our crops and agricultural lands as well. And what about those plants that are significant, or those species that are significant to us? So, I love daffodils. I've recently been gotten into entering my daffodils in the show. And I think that it's really interesting for a culturally significant plant like this. In our community, it's an important plant, daffodils in general, but there's many different varieties that flower at different times. And it's one of the ways that we are starting to maybe adapt some of our behaviors to this changing climate is that we're seeing more calls or more interest in late blooming varieties of daffodils so that we can ensure that there are blooms at the time of the Daffodil Festival, for example. And that might not seem like a really significant adaptation to the changing climate, but it's just an example of something in our community that we might be changing our behaviors and not really realizing it's a response to climate change. It's just an example. And then other things are about the types of plants we harvest, the types of agriculture that we pursue, something like the cranberries. The cranberry harvest, a lot of that commercially has moved further north. And that's sometimes an economic reason, but also it's a climate change effect of what can grow here well, and also the methods for harvesting and that kind of thing. So it's thinking about how we're adapting to what's possible on the island. And it doesn't mean we're going to lose everything, that's going to move further north. It's also about what we're gaining. And in terms of natural climate change adaptation, in addition to something like growing season, something that we're seeing are species range shifts. This is a little bit easier for our birds, especially, and fish, and other species that can move more easily. And so Nantucket, in some ways, is becoming more hospitable to certain species. So a milder winter climate, extended growing seasons make it more hospitable for some, but it actually makes it less hospitable for others. So this first picture I have is of a short-eared owl. Short-eared owls used to be much more prevalent on the island, breeding here, occurring throughout our sandplain grassland habitat. And as they have moved further north into other territories, we have seen other species kind of come in. Not occupying similar habitat, but we have American oyster catchers, which are probably really familiar to anybody who's been on the beaches. They've nested here for a long time. There's lots of data and research on them. The Conservation Foundation has banded them for a long time. But their range in terms of their timing here has also started to expand. More oyster catchers have been seen in the wintertime than in previous years, and that's considered a potential climate change range shift. And so while as researchers, scientists, as land trust managers, we can track these things, and maybe we can provide more breeding habitat for species that are in decline, but then there's other species that we have to respond to, and that might be an adaptation that we have to adapt to ourselves. Something like the southern pine beetle, which many of you have probably heard about in the last year. The southern pine beetle infestation that was found last July was the first infestation on Nantucket. Now, this species is native to the United States, to North America, but it's newer to our region. So it's expanding as warming temperatures and mild winters in particular, we're experiencing more mild winters. And so not only is there the adaptation of the southern pine beetle to be able to live in our area, but then as land managers, we have to respond and adapt our previous land management practices. So there's the initial adaptation of having to respond to this infestation and cut the infected trees. But then there's the long-term management planning that is more informed by these climate changes. For example, now there's a lot more emphasis, and this is broadly on the island, with forest thinning and forest health management. And that wasn't previously something that was prioritized. And so that's an adaptation in our industry. And then Lone Star ticks. See, you said we weren't going to talk about gloom and doom, and I'm like, ticks and pine beetles. Lone Star ticks are another one which has a native to North America, expanded into our region. If you've been out and about in the trails anywhere on the island, you probably have bumped up against a Lone Star tick or two. These have expanded into our area with climate change. Once again, mild winters in particular have allowed them to expand and thrive, unfortunately. But that's meant that those of us that work in the field have had to kind of adapt to those circumstances and taken mitigating, kind of tried to mitigate that exposure to Lone Star ticks, as well as manage the habitats that we know people are going to inhabit, like trails and things like that, to mitigate and lessen that exposure risk to Lone Star ticks. And then using this information, as Jen was saying, with the natural adaptations and the kind of purposeful adaptations, some of the things that we do in land management and conservation is that climate-informed actions. So we're adapting our management practices and work that we're doing, not only for current conditions, but the future conditions as well. And I'm just going to give two examples. So one of the ways that, in general, we can adapt our work for making climate-informed decisions is with restoration planting. So previously, for the last decades, restoration was really about resetting a location to a previous idealized situation. And now we're planting and restoring habitats for the current conditions as well as future conditions. So this image on the left-hand side is part of the north head of Long Pond, which is owned by the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. We've removed a lot of Phragmites, which is a non-native invasive species, along the pond edge, if you can see the cursor. And then we've removed a number of non-native invasive shrubs that are kind of on that pond edge. And instead of replanting that edge habitat with plants that had previously grown there, other native species, we are in this transition, helping with this pond edge transition, planting species that are brackish tolerant as we know that Long Pond is going to continue to be more brackish and have more salt water. And so with that sea level rise expectation, we're helping transition that area to a more brackish tolerant pond edge. And then similarly, in addition to kind of planting, we can plan for more frequent flooding and sea level rise in our restoration and conservation projects. And this is another climate-informed adaptation action. And so this is from the Nantucket Land Bank. I just took this from their website, so thank you to anyone here from the Land Bank. This is the Easton Street Rain Garden, which was recently installed. So if you haven't had a chance to visit it, please do. And it's a way to combine both human use in a nice park that's accessible, that we can all enjoy, as well as creating an area that it can take on stormwater in that area, which is an important ecosystem service in that area. Similarly, near where I live, there are bioswales, which this is late spring when there was a heavy rain event, so there's not a ton growing, but it's an area that's taking on a ton of stormwater in a highly dense area. And so this water, instead of going all over the road and creating a lot of flooding, is actually filtering into a bioswale. So it's another adaptation action that we can take in our community in different areas to mitigate or assist with climate change impacts.
And continuing along the theme of intentional adaptation, ways that within our own work as conservation organizations, we're actually using nature-based solutions to adapt to changes that are happening around us. I wanted to show two projects that we've worked at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. This first one is our oyster reef that was installed in Pulpus Harbor about 3 years ago. And you can see the reef itself in the far picture. I don't know if I can get the cursor going, but this is actually installation day of the reef. And the reef is these long lines that are parallel to a salt marsh that's behind it, and it's made up of oyster castles. There's one right here, and the oyster castle actually has oysters growing on it. We worked in collaboration with the town of Nantucket Natural Resources Department on this project, and the purpose was to see if we could slow down erosion on the shoreline of this salt marsh, because we were seeing increased tides coming in, higher water coming into the marsh, as well as the direction of storms and wave action that are coming up against that marsh. And it wasn't a severe erosion that we were seeing, but we wanted to see if we could slow down that erosion effect while at the same time putting out oysters that could filter and improve water quality and create more habitat along this shoreline. And we've seen a lot of success with it. The oysters have been growing really well. Within just a few years, we've been seeing a decrease in the intensity of wave and water impacts coming up on that shoreline. And we've seen sediment falling between the reef and the salt marsh. So we're kind of capturing some of that sediment that's moving around the harbor. And what we're hoping we're going to see is that the salt marsh might actually grow and advance towards that oyster reef. We want more salt marsh on the island. So the potential for this adaptation is to see if we can increase that habitat over time. And this is a fairly small, easy adaptation that could be used on a lot of the kind of lower intensity shorelines around the island, and could be something that even homeowners could consider in places where they're seeing erosion. The other intentional adaptation, nature-based project I wanted to show you, this is on the other end of the island in Nantucket. This is Hither Creek. This is where the stilt house used to be that was taken down in the same storm, a series of storms that created all of the sand that you see in the picture on the far side. There were storms in 2017 that essentially took away a dune system and a wetland system that were there and created this big sand area, which is beautiful habitat, but is perhaps not quite as resilient as we would want on a South Shore shoreline. So again, this is also a project that we did in collaboration with the town of Nantucket Natural Resources Department. We monitored this, looked at growing some of the dune system, and then actually looked at planting out the dune grasses that would help this dune stabilize, become more resilient, and grow over time. And that increase in resiliency is providing habitat, but is also protecting that area of Hither Creek and Millie's Bridge as well. And this was, so far, knock on wood, been a fairly successful project, and we haven't seen the kind of erosion that everyone was really worried was going to happen out here immediately afterwards. And part of that is because while this dune might have come back on its own eventually, we actively helped it adapt and grow over time. very active adaptation. And a lot of volunteers helped plant this dune. So what does climate change adaptation look like? What can it look like? I grabbed this image, and the second part of it will be on the next slide that I show you, from the World Economic Organization that presented this at one of the climate change summits this year. And it's a diagram that not all of it applies to us, but a lot of it can apply to us here on Nantucket, thinking about really successfully adapting to climate change is adapting within our built environment and within our natural environment. And some things that as a community we can do and promote, low emission energy production, figuring out sustainable mobility, sustainable tourism might be something that rings a bell out here on Nantucket. Really, that's a little bit. Things we can do on our own, like harvesting rainwater. If you're someone that is doing agriculture, looking at mixed and diverse crops, there's a lot of things that can go into making us adapt, but also be more resilient into the future. And as we move into the conversations we're going to have with our panelists today, some of the things you're going to hear echoes of are thinking about native species that are adapting to that climate change. What does biodiversity look like? Healthy soils. Are we adapting our buildings to what's happening with climate change? How can we think about how climate change is impacting our, built infrastructure? Sustainable fisheries, thinking about the health within our water systems. These are all pieces that here in this community on Nantucket, people are already working on, or already adapting within their own professions, within their own businesses. And then there are things as a community that we can think about making sure our priorities as we move into the next few years. So setting up what we're going to do with the rest of the day or the evening here is we have a suite of panelists here that are each going to come up and talk to you a little bit about the change that they're seeing or have seen within their own professions over the years, how they might be seeing adaptation happening, how they might be adapting already, suggestions they might have for us. We kind of gave this task to our speakers to talk about, what does this mean within their own profession. And we have three really great speakers here today, and Matt Herr is going to talk from Gray Lady Oysters. We have Niles Parker from the Nantucket Historical Association, and Julie Jordan from the Garden Design Group. And they're each going to talk for about 12 minutes, and then Cecil Jensen from Remain is joining us and is going to help moderate a panel where she has some questions, but we also want to give the audience a chance to ask questions and have a community conversation about change that we're seeing. So with that, okay. We're going to invite up our first speaker today. Matt Herr is the owner of Gray Lady Oysters. Matt has over 40 years of commercial fishing experience on this island in various different fishing industries. He's worked in cod fishing, lobstering, scalloping, conch farming, and now oyster farming for the last 11 years. And we're really excited to hear what Matt has to tell us about what he's seen in his industry. So Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm glad to see everyone looks friendly and kind and generous out there tonight. I am definitely not in my wheelhouse, and that was a wonderful presentation. I think that what I'm going to talk about tonight is a bit more about the mindset that being a commercial fisherman and oyster farmer brings to the table. I don't have quite the specifics, but what a great introduction. So that kind of screwed up the beginning of my written comments, but I'm going to apologize again for the beginning here because it's going to take me a little while to get going, and I'll probably look down a lot. So, okay, so that was talked about. Okay, so I am Matt, and I've been coming to Nantucket since the 1970s with my family. As a young boy, I was always fascinated by all things having to do with the sea and the creatures that live there. I began my career on the water by taking a job on a cod fishing boat in the mid-'80s during my summers while in college. Upon graduating and moving to Nantucket, I began to dabble in bay scalloping. After a stint painting houses to finance a long-dreamed of trip across the country to Alaska, I returned to Nantucket to take the spot of sternman for local lobster legend Chuck Butler. After several seasons lobstering, I had the opportunity to set out on my own fishing a conch permit held by another island waterfront legend, Joe Lopes. This chapter led to a 30-year career in the conch fishery, along with bay scalloping during the winter months. In 2013, I started an oyster farm, which brings me to the present day. Since my earliest introduction to commercial fishing, I was acutely aware of the change that can affect this profession. I caught the tail end of the roaring cod fishery, which was already in steep decline by the time I took my first trip. It was my first direct experience of how man-made pressure can have such a dramatic effect. My early years of scalloping were an experience of relative abundance, with the fishery still producing up to 40,000 bushels annually, which today is unheard of. 30 years of conch fishing has also seen dramatic declines in landings from when I started. My move to oyster farming was primarily an effort to diversify from the unpredictable nature of wild fisheries. Although the declines in abundance that I have witnessed over my career do not correspond to climate change per se, they are nevertheless man-made. As a commercial fisherman and oyster farmer, it is your capacity for observation that is your strongest asset. As in most things, the difference between excellence and mediocrity can be a tiny measure. The best fishermen I have known were very keen to small details. Success or failure depend on the correct reading of conditions, wind, tide, water temperature, to name just a few. Diligent attention to these variables was critical and ongoing. These fishers had an encyclopedic understanding of their environment built over decades. They were masters of innovation and problem solving. So how does this relate to climate change? To me, the methodology is the same. Recognize what's happening by making use of all the observable clues and use these as a guide towards a favorable outcome. Although Nantucket and the Northeast has so far been spared the most dramatic effects of climate change, the devil is always in the details. The very subtle changes that can take place in any natural setting due to a changing environment can be in some instances dramatic, or a key factor in a chain reaction. The most significant example of environmental change that I have witnessed over the years has been the relative mildness of our winters. It used to be that most years you could count on a deep and prolonged freeze, resulting in an icebound harbor and associated water temperatures, low water temperatures. Now, I'm no scientist, but loss of these deep freezes combined with warmer peak summer temperatures, combined with the greater development of the island and the greater use of our water bodies for recreation and transport, is a potent cocktail. I would say we ignore these changes and interactions at our own peril. As overwhelming as the overall concept of climate change is, it comes as no surprise that many react with denial or helplessness or hopelessness. In the face of these challenges, I feel a great starting point when reckoning with the impacts of modern life on Nantucket is threefold: recognizing the problems, being accountable, and then taking action. I am by no means an expert on how to solve the world's large and seemingly intractable problems, so I look forward to this discussion and the sharing of ideas that we have come here tonight to be a part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That was fantastic. I know you were nervous, but that was absolutely fantastic. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure everyone knows we are going to be taking questions at the end. So if you have specific questions for Matt, kind of log them in your head, type it out on your phone, or if you have something to write down so you remember for later. We're going to go through all of our speakers first, and then we're going to have our panel questions all together. All right. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker tonight. Niles Parker is our executive director of the Nantucket Historical Association. He's going to be talking about methodology for climate change risk assessment and sustainable future and Nantucket's built heritage. So please help me welcome Niles.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and great to see everyone. I'm going to stick fairly close to my script. I've got a lot I kind of want to get through, so try to get in right at 12 minutes here. I know many people are probably familiar with this image. It's one of many that were generated as part of Resilient Nantucket and that initiative from about 5 years ago that Remain and the University of Florida and Preservation Institute Nantucket and NPT and the town and others were involved with. These images alarmed and I think clearly motivated people. I know it did for folks at the NHA. With 2 historic buildings on the front lines of the flood zone, the Nantucket Historical Association really began to consider, what do we do with our historic properties? How could we plan for the future? And how could we better understand the risks from climate change? And not only what was being projected in 2030, 2060, 2100, but what might already be happening. We had some pretty good ideas, I think, that there was already change afoot. And what could we be doing to address that? In the summer of 2022, Marty Hilton, who I know many of you know and was involved with PIN during that earlier project, and he was then with the National Park Service, approached us about partnering with the Park Service to bring a conference to Nantucket. The idea was to bring scientists, researchers, professors from around the world to the island to discuss the impact of climate change on cultural heritage and the built environment. That conference took place at the Whaling Museum in December of 2022. Coming out of that conference, one of the big takeaways was that while there's quite a bit of science around climate change generally and the threat of sea level rise, there was virtually no work being done on the impact of climate change on building materials, particularly as it related to museums, collections, and historic sites. So it became evident to several participants at the conference that Nantucket, with its large historic district on this sandbar of an island 30 miles out in the middle of the ocean, might be a really great lab for exploring this idea. So the conference ended with a partnership in place, actually. It was pretty exciting. We teamed up with the International Center for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, or ICROM, based in Rome, Integrated Conservation Resources and Integrated Conservation Contracting, or ICR-ICC, which is a private company consisting of a team of architectural conservators, scientists, and craftspeople, as well as the University of Pennsylvania's Historic Preservation Program. We created a field study internship, which was held last summer, that welcomed 8 students from the UPenn program to Nantucket and was led by Rohit Jigyasu of ICROM and Glenn Bornasian of ICR-ICC. The basic premise of the program and the challenge the NHA faced was that in order to fully understand the evolving condition of our properties, we needed to have better, more current data. I mean, kind of riffing off what you just said, Matt, in terms of trying to see what observe what we're seeing, and then how do we react accordingly. What was happening to these structures at the very local level? We weren't quite sure. We needed to collect information that could provide us with actionable steps. So much is changing so frequently now with climate change. More precipitation, rising groundwater levels, stronger storms, changing prevailing wind directions, increased humidity, which leads to rising amounts of mold, rising amounts of biogrowth. We were observing parts of all of that. But how do we know sort of what to attack first? And we kind of came back to that old adage, you can't manage what you can't measure. So we built off of one of the case studies that had been presented at the symposium. It was a project with the U.S. Park Service in the southwest region of the United States. And the underlying concept there was that if one designed a really well-informed rapid risk assessment survey tool and carried that out over numerous sites in a defined region, then one could really begin to choose a specific set of sites that are more or less representative of that entire region and dive really deep. So drilling down even further, one could select extremely specific locations or materials within those sites, and through close analysis, that might reveal clues about what was going on in that building, in that material, and in that larger region. We did not limit our approach to the exterior of the buildings. We considered their surrounding landscapes as well as the interiors. We also began to consider how our collections housed within each building might be reacting. We were always guided by the challenge of how do we capture the most complete holistic view of each property. Over the 8-week period, the group interfaced with numerous on-island experts, many of whom I know are in this room tonight, various threats that were already perceived, understanding the work being carried out regarding the environment and landscape on the island, movable heritage conservation, as well as built heritage conservation. We developed an entire sort of curriculum framework for what they were going to do and how this was going to be learned and then processed. After the completion of the introduction to the island and its history, we began our overall assessment of the island with the intent to understand different environmental exposure zones, identifying representative sites, structures, and materials within those zones. Building from that, the students established a more holistic approach to assessing the risks that were facing each site, each region, and the island. The students created this risk assessment outline to guide their work further. We then designed a rapid risk assessment tool and digital survey form that the students could use on their iPhones or their iPads as they went around to each of the properties to more easily gather their observations and key measurements. We implemented that survey, which culminated with the identification of specific sites that we felt best represented the island and its endangered architectural heritage. And as a result of that work, and in an effort again to kind of really focus and drill down, we wanted to get to that sort of hyper-local level. We picked 4 sites: the Jethro Coffin House, or the oldest house, the Candle Factory at the Whaling Museum, the Thomas Macy Warehouse, and Greater Light. The students then carried out many of the steps you see here in terms of archival research, and site context analysis, conditions assessments, et cetera. Performed detailed measurements, and ultimately performed quite a bit of modeling. The goal of this activity was to determine original design, analysis of materials, changes over time, and to identify any problems that may have existed in the past and how they had been repaired over time. Condition and location were factors, certainly in deciding which to focus on. We liked the idea of 2 brick buildings, so the Macy Warehouse and the Candle Factory at the museum, 2 wood frame buildings, Greater Light and the oldest house. 2 were in town near the water, 2 were kind of uphill out of town. So that gave us opportunities to compare and contrast those structures and their specific locations. I'm only showing Greater Light here, but for each property we carried out some of the same analysis. Again, in addition to the survey of the buildings and materials, the students did quite a bit of work in modeling the surrounding landscape and topography in order to better understand how the buildings were responding to change and being affected by the conditions. And finally, attempted to sort of pull it all back together and make sense of everything that they had captured. So as much of the data as they had collected, we circled back to each of the 4 properties and attempted to summarize our understanding of each site and what was going on. And you can see here they were looking at sort of all of the issues from existing conditions to the vulnerabilities like accessibility, humidity, insulation or not, the type of materials, brick, mortar, wood, shingles, et cetera. So understanding all of that really gave us a better ability to develop a risk assessment for that location and better understand what kind of future impacts and change that we might expect these historic buildings to go through. It gives us a baseline to begin developing conservation and treatment plans for each of our properties, something that we really haven't had before. Again, you can't manage what you can't measure, was the idea behind it. One of the most important elements of the program is centered in data capture. And because weather factors are changing over time, and climate is a longer-term view of that change, requiring months, years, if not decades of study to sort of see the trends, we knew we couldn't just base our decisions in one moment in time. What the students captured in the summer of 2023 will be very different from what they might see this year and certainly next year and beyond. And so in order to make our decisions with as much relevance and accuracy as possible, we decided to install weather stations at each of the properties so that we can track this data and update our analysis going forward. We installed systems that are capturing a variety of data points at each site, as well as, in addition to the 4 I mentioned, as well as the Pacific Club at the foot of Main Street that has water in the basement, sort of standing water at all times, and we were curious to do analysis around that. And so we were able to look at things like temperature, relative humidity, wind speed and direction, groundwater levels, groundwater temperature, salinity in the groundwater, and more. You see on the map here that has those 5, those monitoring sites already in place. So the monitoring program now has about 9 months of data, and it's continuing to collect it. We're looking at methods of overlaying and interpreting that information, reviewing it and modifying it. And while we need to collect much, much more of this data over time to provide real trend lines, we are already seeing some interesting results and have begun to consider how to apply that data that we've already collected. We're looking at the inclusion of additional sites and beginning the early stages of design and application of potential treatment programs for various buildings and materials. We'll be conducting sort of our second year this fall, a joint program with ICROM in November, bringing mid-career professionals from different countries to the island to help us dig in on this topic. And related to all of this, the NHA is beginning to explore the creation of an architectural conservation and resilience lab that we might be able to better analyze building material, not just for our buildings, but hopefully becomes a resource for the island in general. In closing, one of the prompts that they had, that Jen and Sarah had asked us to consider is what would we like to see down the road or in 10 years' time. And I guess my thoughts are, one, we are doing a ton of work on Nantucket, all of us collectively, which is amazing. I'd love to see us try not to work in silos as much. I mean, events like this that break that down, that share information, that think about how we communicate and collaborate together is going to be critically important. I think effective public-private partnerships are going to be a key part of what we do going forward. I'd love to see us build this network of data points. I think this kind of hyper-local data that we can collect and then overlay it with regional and national trends can provide really interesting information. And examine these in a holistic way that considers, again, for buildings, the surrounding landscape, the rising groundwater levels, stormwater drainage patterns, wastewater infrastructure, et cetera. And while there's a lot, rightfully, of concern about incoming harbor water and rising sea level, we've got to be really mindful of the rising groundwater and sort of, if you're downtown, what's coming at you from behind, down the hill. We are seeing a pretty scary amount of rising groundwater that's impacting some of our buildings on a very, very real basis. And as one way, I am wrapping up quickly, I swear, I promise. One way to sort of show the results of these data systems, the Pacific Club that I mentioned, standing water, a lot of people had just assumed that it was tidal, that it was going up and down based on the tides. Now that we've got the monitoring systems in there, it's not. We can show that. It's stormwater. And thinking about all the water that's coming down Main Street and collecting right there at the base is a big issue. And I guess the other thing that I'd love to see is thinking about, and I know this is being discussed, but sort of a building with Nantucket in mind version 2.0 that brings us to the current day and has chapters on climate change, a table on various building materials and how they react to increased temperature, humidity, wind loads, mold, et cetera. And how does one begin to monitor these changes on the interiors as well as the exteriors, impact on furniture, textiles, interior finishes, and so forth. I could go on forever. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that we could be talking about, but I do keep coming back to the fact there's so much already going on, which is pretty wonderful. And by trying to better aggregate all of this work, and by drilling down to the very local level, I think we can collect this data and paint a more informed picture of the current conditions and the changes that are already happening, and then better understand what might be coming. I think that can be a model for other towns and organizations that I hope are increasingly trying to develop a more holistic approach to heritage preservation. Thank you.
Niles, thank you so much. That was extremely informative, and we appreciate your time. Next up, I'm going to invite our last panelist to come up and present. I'm inviting Julie Jordan, who is the owner of the Garden Design Company. Julie has been designing landscapes and has been gardening on Nantucket since 1995 and is a recognized expert in sustainable landscapes. And we're really excited to hear what she has to tell us today. Julie, thank you.
Hi, it's so nice to see such a great turnout. I think there's so much that we can all do to better our community and our environment, especially engaging in our home gardens. And I'm excited to talk about how climate change is affecting horticulture and the landscape design industry. First, a little bit about my background. I am going to stick also to my script, so I might look down a little bit, but I have some great slides to show you. I've been in horticulture almost my whole life. I got my first job in the industry when I was 14 at a landscape nursery, hand watering a 5-acre nursery. My love of plants started there. But before that, it runs in my family. So this is my great-grandfather who graduated from Penn State, where I graduated from as an agricultural land-grant college. And one neat thing that you can pick up from this picture is he was gardening before there were pesticides, herbicides, or grocery stores. So you can see he's got carrots and he's got tomatoes, which are the original companion plants. And attention to detail in our natural landscapes, paying attention to what the plants need with your eyes and your hands, rather than blanket use of chemicals, is important. And I learned that from a young age. As a student, I continued to be drawn towards plants and horticulture, majoring in landscape design and contracting at Penn State. And it's one of the first hands-on landscape design build programs in the country. This is one of the landscapes I've recently designed for a client. I love mixing in as many native plants as possible. And when you get a good client that really wants to do that, this is 80 to 90% native landscape. So the national goal should be around 70%. From the National Wildlife Institute, they want you to have 70% native plants. When I moved to Nantucket in 1996, that's not exactly what people were doing. I was really enamored with the sandy soil and the plants growing basically on nothing. But roses, hydrangea, privet, that's what everyone wanted. And climate change has caused the industry to deal with longer seasons, increased pressure from animals, southern invasive plants, extreme weather patterns. And now as an industry, we are maintaining these plants way longer. So like when I first started working in 1996, the average season was 22 to 24 weeks is what I would tell. Oh, that's how long we'll take care of this garden and then we'll be done. I'm averaging now 30 weeks of maintenance from the start of the season to the end of the season to maintain these landscapes. So there are much more inputs all across the board, which is even more reason that the plants need to be less maintenance. That's a pretty big change in that many years. So the other thing that's happening is we have a lot of southern plants coming north, and we have a lot of plants overwintering that maybe wouldn't, and they're mingling themselves into our natural environment. Here on the left, you see crepe myrtle, which when I started in 1995, you would never have seen that overwinter and live. And in the South, it is a kind of a non-native species that seeds everywhere into native habitats. And that's going to happen here. So, it's important that people learn culturally to deadhead them, not let them go to seed. If you're going to have an ornamental landscape like that, this is you got to maintain it. But at the same time, what I would like to see people do is use a different type of plant. Miscanthus, when I started, this was the industry gold standard for a seagrass, is what all the clients would say. I want seagrasses. And this is a Japanese invasive, and now you see it all through the middle moors invading our grasslands. And a simple thing that most homeowners and landscape people that they don't do, maybe you can't afford to remove all these from your landscape, but you can not let them go to seed. So there's one simple thing that you could do to stop these from invading our natural landscapes. Also more extreme weather, some cold snaps that have hurt our native hydrangeas. But when I first started here, it would be very, very cold. Now you get really warm weather followed by really, really cold snaps, which damage these more babied horticultural plants. So another reason to kind of move away from them and have them more minimal in our landscapes. So we also have a lot more extreme weather and coastal flooding, this is happening about 5 to 7 times a year. When I first started doing this work on the island, this was, Bob was such a big deal and everybody was like, oh my gosh, downtown flooded. But now it's happening 5 times a year. So that's a change. In horticulture, we're working to increase the awareness and options for people to combat climate change. And having traditional alternatives to traditional landscape elements and planting natives really does make a difference. And this slide really shows you how the fescue grass, or just your regular grass, lawn grass, how shallow the roots are. And look at American beach grass going down to 7-8 feet. And then a common 9-bark, which isn't native here, but this would be like a viburnum dentatum, 8 feet. And a lot of times something you can think of is when you have a native plant, they're going down as high as they're going up. So think of all that increased soil retention and stabilization that they're getting. So this is a native landscape recently designed and using green mulch. This is Irogrostis spectabilis, and if you look around into the native areas, you'll find it dotted. But I like to try and paint the landscape in familiar patterns like that you would traditionally see in a landscape design, but these are all natives. So this is requiring very little inputs. It's contributing, but it's organized in a way that people want to see in their gardens close to their homes. And the other thing that the horticultural industry is doing is shifting the things that are available. So this is a low mow fescue grass that doesn't require as much maintenance as the traditional Cape Cod or bluegrass, and I recommend that. Then there's also things on the market now like micro clover and more traditional like a primula lawn grass, and I think it's a great way to reduce the amount of irrigation and inputs into the earth. Here again, this is not using any turf grass and a nice path through some ornamental grasses. And this shows Mother Nature. She's a really hard competitor. So my whole career, I've been studying Mother Nature and how she combines all these plants together. And I think as a community, we need to plant landscapes that are not monocultures and that bring a lot of diversity. This is, and now I'm just going to walk you through a couple projects that show you what has happened in landscape in the time that I've been here. So this is the iconic house on the cliff. I've had the pleasure of working here for 2 decades. This is what it looked like when I first started there, and this is how that homeowner really wanted to maintain it. Very no nature. We're not allowed to have nature. Recently, it's changed hands to someone that was very into ecology. And so we've started to really increase the biodiversity and the dynamic nature of the landscape. And you can see we're getting a lot of pollinators. And even though it's still with the roses, we still have to occasionally treat the roses. They get powdery mildew. We've stopped treating them and we've added some other lower maintenance roses. But all in all, I think the message is that every little bit does count. And everything you can do, and you don't have to destruct your whole landscape to add a little bit of native planting and contribute. And then I had the pleasure of working with Michael van Valkenburg and the Land Bank on the Easy Street Park. So this photo is, this is from January 2024. And you can see that it's, kind of remarkable at the 2005. And this is what it looks like in the summer. And I just wanted to walk through how we built it and kind of the more dynamic landscapes and what they take to make. You can see here that the layers of soil are on sand, and we built the layers like they were the natural stratification of the soil. And we had inundated groundwater the whole time coming up. So we had to really make sure that we kept the root balls above the groundwater. And, at one point, someone from one of the construction crews said, well, can't you just stop? Where's the water coming from? I'm like, below you. We can't stop it. So, people can't quite wrap their head around where it comes from. It's not coming from the ocean. It's coming from the ground. And we did a lot of flagging because this took us 3 seasons to install, because one of the things to know about a dynamic landscape is that there's cool season, warm season, there's shrubs and woodies, and they can't all go in at the same time because they're not ready. So it takes 18 months to build a real plant community that can contribute and have different root layers. And so what we did is we marked out what we wanted by different colored flags. And then as they came in, we would take that plug, like the yellow was Bootalua. And when the Bootalua came in and the 1,000 plugs, we would go in and we'd take all the yellow plugs and put a Bootalua there. And then when the next group of things came in the late summer, we would go in and do that group until we were down to 2 flags. And now you can see this kind of really growing in, and people are really enjoying it. And one of the things about it is we don't put any fertilizer on it. And all of the grasses at the end of the year, to kind of keep it tidy, we chop and drop, and we use that as our mulch. And there's a lot of, pollinators and interesting plants coming up in there. This is a native meadow that I installed for some clients. When I met these clients, this was a turf grass hillside being maintained within 300 yards of the harbor. And it was bluegrass, and they were fertilizing it, and there was tons of irrigation, and it was soggy and disgusting. And they were lucky enough to own a lot of land. So we harvested their own blue stem in the fall, and we made a clean slate, and then we reseeded the blue stem we harvested from their other natural areas and made this meadow. This is the first year, and this is the second year. And now what you see happening, I wish I had a photo for right now, because it's really interesting how nature will regenerate itself, because now I've got asters and all kinds of things coming into this meadow that you wouldn't have expected, that I didn't seed. And so I would say patience, nature will regenerate itself. I think don't give ourselves too much credit. If you get the engine started, she will take over. This is also another native meadow, but I am going to wrap up now. And I hope this gives you an idea of how horticulture has changed in the 30 years that I've been working in it, and gives you some ideas on how you at home can combat climate change. And, don't give up the ship. I hope everyone will look at Homegrown National Park. I'm a big supporter of theirs. And the nice thing about what they do is they're not working in USDA zones. They're working in like alluvial zones, so they can help you see how plants are going to move through climate change and using native plants to your area. So I would recommend everyone look that up, and you can see what insects benefit from which plants. Like an oak is way more beneficial than planting, a pear tree, because you can feed, 40 clutches of chicks with one oak tree. So if you can figure out how to plant some keystone plants and change over your turf to a less maintenance turf and make more plant communities, I think you would be combating climate change right on your own patch of grass. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. I really appreciate everyone who's been talking so far. All right, so I am going to invite all of our panelists up to your stools. Maybe we can move the stools over a little bit while you go up. But while our panelists are getting settled, I wanted to introduce our moderator, Cecil Barron Jensen. Cecil Barron Jensen is the executive director of Remain. Some of Remain's signature initiatives that have been launched during Cecil's tenure include Nantucket Footprints, More Nantucket, and the Envision Resilience Challenge. In addition, under her leadership, the organization has focused on food systems, food insecurity, affordable housing, architectural salvage reuse, and nature-based solutions for climate change. Please help me welcome Cecil Barron Jensen. All right, you can take the mic out, or you can whatever. Great.
Hi, everyone. So interesting. Let's give everybody a big round of applause. That was just so good. Before I pepper them with some questions, I'll just remind you that you will also have time for questions, and Sarah and Jen are going to have a microphone to bring it to you. So think about your questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I first want to just say that image that Niles shared of Strait Wharf and the Macy warehouse absolutely stopped me in my tracks. And I think it did for all of us. it was a really powerful presentation that the Preservation Institute Nantucket gave to us as a community. And then, of course, Marianne Stanton thought it was so impactful that she put it on the front page of the newspaper. So that was in 2019. And I think it truly has jump-started all of our efforts. And Niles is right. I think, we have the privileged position of sitting at 58 Main Street and partnering with a lot of you in the work that you're doing to be more prepared for the changes that are coming our way. And, so while there are silos, I do think we as a community should really feel proud of ourselves for the work that we've done in the years since we saw those initial images. And it really is what I heard today from all of you. I heard the theme I heard is observation, attention to detail, action plan. That's it. And I think as a community, we've been very good at observing a problem and then trying to get ahead of it. One of the things that we at Remain really love to do is to provide some of the data, some of the tools for understanding what these changes really are all about. And then once we have it figured out what that attention to detail is telling us, then we can develop action plans. And that's what adaptation that's when adaptation kicks in. That's what I would love to see, and I'm seeing all over the island. And I think, our speakers have brought up some wonderful examples of living, breathing adaptation stories. So let's get into it a little bit. Matt, I absolutely loved your expression, capacity for observation. I think that's something that I'm going to hold on to and remember that for going forward. The capacity to pause and observe is so powerful. I'd love to know what you've observed in our harbor over your time growing and cultivating oysters. What changes have you observed in the water quality, and what have you seen that has helped? Maybe, I guess it's pretty well documented that growing shellfish and kelp and helping eelgrass actually does have a positive effect on the water quality. I'm wondering if you actually see that in action. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what you've observed over the time with our water quality. And then maybe as a secondary question attached to that is, what can we do as a community to make sure that the water quality continues to improve, at least in your little patch of the harbor?
Okay, that's a tall one.
Julie, will you share the mic?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sure. No, I'm always kind of worried about these things. Anyway, the changes that I've seen in the harbor, there's a lot of them. Anytime that you have a rapid development of a space like we have here surrounding a pretty precious and sensitive resource as the harbor, there's going to be impacts. And I think that throughout the 80s, those impacts weren't quite appreciated, but they weren't as intensive either. What we're seeing now that I would say is a significant issue is the disruption of our eelgrass beds. And that is something that to remediate that involves a lot of different things, and a lot of different things are happening already. The monitoring of the water quality, the steps that are being taken right now to plant eelgrass and to protect the eelgrass that we have. Up in Waltwinet with the oyster farms, it seems, at least through things that people have told me, they feel that the water quality up there is improving I'd like to say that that may have something to do with the oysters that are being grown up there. But I think that it would take more of that kind of thing going on to make a real imprint. But there's no question that having oysters around is a win-win for the harbor in terms of filtrating that water. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about application of fertilizers. I'm sure Julie could speak quite a bit to that because the runoff is an issue. The inputs that are going into the harbor, although we are able to measure them, we aren't quite sure yet what the long-term effects of those inputs are. I mean, you can talk to a landscaper and they'll say it's not the fertilizers, it's the septic, or the septic people say it's not the septic, but I'm not going to throw the landscapers under the bus, it's the pesticides. And it goes around and around and around, and everybody, who's observing that drama has to make that decision for themselves and then decide what they're going to do and what they think matters. And it's probably a little bit of all those things. A couple of really big things that have happened in my time has been the studies that have gone into the dynamics of the hydrology in the harbor and the flushing and where the currents are. Getting the jetties raised was a huge thing. It just increased the flow. Ever since they raised the jetty, you can really notice the velocity changes in the harbor. I don't think they've been quantified yet, but you can just go out there and you can tell the way the rips make up on every single point, and it's like a raging river sometimes during moon tides and stuff like that, and you just know that there's a lot of circulation going on right there, and circulation is key. Is it keeping up? I would say that the fact that we aren't all, looking up and thinking the sky is falling is a good sign. Usually when it gets really bad, that's when everybody, steps up to say, oh my God, the water's brown now, what are we going to do? We still have a wonderful scallop fishery, and that's in great thanks to the efforts of the Natural Resources Department and all the things that they do, and all of the collaborations that they do with the Conservation Foundation and Mariah Mitchell and the propagation efforts down at the lab. Not to be shamelessly plugging my wife, Tara Riley, but she has done a lot of work with getting shellfish introduced to the harbor at the right time, taking into consideration the tidal flows, recruitment areas versus grow out areas, and moving those seed around so that the most amount of those seed are able to survive and carry on a strong biomass that's capable of supporting our fishery. So these are all really great things, and there's always going to be more work to be done, and everybody, like I've alluded to in my comments, everybody can recognize these things, and if you're a caring, well-meaning person, you can go out there and sign up for any number of these projects and volunteer efforts to keep the ball rolling. And I think education is also education, whether it's you talking to your neighbor. And it starts with just something that you share in common, like a love of eating bay scallops or, catching the fish that we're seeing here. There are just so many things on this island that we can come together over. And then it becomes persuasion and not coercion in the effort to make things better.
That's great.
So
Thank you. Great. That's perfect. Thank you so much. Niles, one of the things that you said is using Nantucket as a lab. I love the project you were talking about, because not only are we being operating as a lab locally for other historic buildings on the island, but we're actually being a lab for people who are studying in Rome and all over the world. I think that's just so fabulous, and again, deeply aligned with what Remain likes to see happening on the island. That the lessons that we learn here, being an isolated little community, can be applied elsewhere. So I guess my question for you is, again, I've sort of a two-part question. How are you talking to your visitors and members about this work? And how would you like us to talk about it in the community? It doesn't sound like it's quite yet. You're giving us a toolkit, but you are doing so much of the foundational work that eventually will influence how we manage our own houses. So how would you like us, how are you talking about it, and how would you like us to talk about it?
Good question. So we started to build a website specifically related to that project that we were going to get up and going next year, and then just wanted to get some more information from the students and better fill that out. And so I think we'll go live with that probably this fall after the second group comes through, and we're able to update some of that. We do have some material on our site now about various properties and some of the initiatives that we're doing in this regard. We've had a number of programs, lectures, things like that about it. And if you're able to go to some of our historic properties and interact with our guides who are there, hopefully more and more, that'll be a part of the story that we're telling at each of the sites. But it's a great question, because I think we could do a lot more in that regard. I really do think we could embrace our educational mantra and begin to share some of this.
Well, I imagine that people are coming into, say, the Whaling Museum and saying, do you get flooding here, or do you ever have water in your basement?
Yeah.
So how are you answering those questions? And I guess, it's something that we all know about resilience, that there's only a limited number of things that we can do to be truly resilient. But one of them is to talk about it, to share the stories and not pretend that it's not happening. So I imagine you've got one-on-one conversations in your properties.
We definitely do. Yep. We do get asked that question quite a bit. We're about to have a big exhibit in some ways that wasn't of our choosing, that we're going to be able to use as a way to tell the story at the Whaling Museum in the brick candle factory, which was built in 1847. That north wall, I showed a photo of some of the students looking at it both from the inside and the outside. The students last year really helped uncover some pretty substantive structural issues that we needed to solve. And so fortunately, we were able to go with all the information that we had gleaned, go to the CPC for a grant that's going to help underwrite the cost of renovating that wall. And it's going to be about an 8-month process. We're going to have to empty out a lot of the artifacts from it, and it's going to be very visible. And so we're just talking about, how do we embrace that? How do we use that as a way to tell the story of what we're doing and why? Some of it is about construction techniques from years ago that probably weren't optimal, but much of it is definitely about climate change and in looking at sort of what that wall has been exposed to from flooding from the ground up, and then looked at how we have air controlled it, HVAC controlled it from the inside, which more and more really is a significant issue, to think that through a little bit better. And so how do we tackle that? And then to your point, Cecil, how do we share that story with our visitors? So I'd rather we not be tackling $1 million renovation of the north wall of the candle factory. But if we're going to do it, we might as well make it a way to, tell that story.
Great. Thanks, Niles. And Julie, you offered so many wonderful examples of how we as homeowners and I'm not going to call myself a landscaper because I know very little about plants. I'm a land steward. There we go. You offered so many great examples of ways to be more resilient in the face of climate issues and just changes in our landscape across the island. I really would love for you to talk a little bit. I'm going to put you in between Niles and Matt, because in many ways the landscape is that connective tissue between what's happening in the harbor and what's happening in buildings. So, I think we've all had to think a little bit differently about how we landscape, because the climate is wetter so that our basements don't get moldy and damp. Or we've had to think about how to tackle pruning trees that are going crazy at certain times of the year so they don't take down the shingles on the side of our house. So I really think that there's something very interesting about what the work that you do in terms of how we can look after the materials within our buildings, but also be really considerate about what we're putting into the water table below us and what's running off into the harbor. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Sure. I think one of the most important things is that whether it's your house, your mother's house, whoever's landscape you're interacting with, your neighbor, a cocktail party you're at, perhaps. But I think that capturing rainwater and making sure that it's reused so that you're not running off, making sure that all your water is being kept on your own property and either being reused or properly filtrated is one first step that we always consider when we're designing or building a project. The second would be to only have as much turf grass and frivolous plants as you absolutely need, right? So if you're not going to play football every day after work, maybe you don't need 100 by 50 lawn. And it's important to really look inside, and I encourage my clients to do that. How much do you need? And when could you go to the school and play football? Do you really need this much turf grass? And then making an alternative choice besides turf grass, changing your aesthetic to meet these goals for the community, lower water, different grass types. I have to say, in the industry, I struggle installing these amazing products. And then you turn it over to a landscaper or steward that then applies the same thing as if it was bluegrass. So then I'm constantly going back, putting labels in the clocks, putting labels with the client, emailing saying, you do not need to fertilize this. Stop. Let nature take its course a little bit. So I think letting our hair down and our landscapes would be really good. And then as much as you can, try and build plant communities that support wildlife, and understanding that land that's not inside the four walls of your house belongs to nature. And that if you can have berries and you can have viburnum, you can have all these different things that intermingle. Number one, you can combat the deer by mixing lots of different plants and planting them densely, planting them as mature as you can, and carpeting the ground with grasses and perennials and forbs so that you're not mulching. So at the end of the season, you are just cutting those things back and letting them lay, and maybe taking a rake if you're a real OCD person. There are options for you. See me after this if you can't handle that. I can help you get there. But everybody has a chance in their house. And just as Matt was saying, when you start talking about it and you have a friend that has a giant lawn and you start doing it at your own house, and then they see it and then they say, hey, maybe I don't need that. It becomes a movement, and it's motivating, and the aesthetic changes. And I think since I've been here on Nantucket, the aesthetic has changed. I mean, Paulette Bowling's Salt Marsh Center landscape would not have flown in 1995. Mm-hmm. But now it's so gorgeous, and it's combating flooding waters and giving people joy. So I think we can all do that.
It's all about being hopeful. Yeah, I agree. And Sarah and Jen, you mentioned that too, that, we can't just focus on the changes and wring our hands and say, the sky is falling. Well, in some case, the skies are falling. But it is about being hopeful. So on that note, I'd love for each of you just to give me just a couple of quick words of the things that make you really hopeful in your industries. And Julie, since you've got you can start right there. Yeah.
I think I see a lot of people moving towards less buttoned up landscapes and relaxing a bit, and understanding that Nantucket's about being here. And not, I had to explain to someone, a garden is something you do. It's not something you have. You have to embrace this feeling of letting nature back into our lots as a community, and I see that happening. So it gives me a lot of hope. And being here, I mean, I think this is amazing. And I was a little worried because, you know, my industry is complicated with the environment. So I was, you know, we've done some things that I'm like, okay, that's not good. So I think, you know, everybody coming with an open heart and trying to do their best, and as much as you can learn, then you can do better. So
Thank you. Matt, what makes you hopeful?
I think what makes me hopeful is a little bit negated by what I also fear from it. One thing that I see every single day out on the harbor is people out enjoying and using it in every way that you can imagine. And in that sense, people are really building a relationship with the harbor and a stewardship of the harbor where you enjoy something, you want to take care of it, you want to make sure that it stays the same as the way you are enjoying it. But the flip side of that is, with all of that additional use, there are, you know, whether it's power boats or whether it's even just the horsepower of the power boats or how quickly they're moving, it's a very shallow harbor for the most part. And so when you're boating, I think that you really need to exercise care in the way you're operating and realize that there's horsepower that's driving you from here to there. And that turbidity agitates the eelgrass. One thing that I notice a lot out on the harbor right now is these annual drifts of what appear, at least to me, to be completely viable, healthy eelgrass that's floating in great rafts on the harbor surface. And I'm not sure whether I'm not sure what that is. Like, I think that we're going to need to look at that, because something makes me feel like something's undermining the roots of this eelgrass, and that it's much more susceptible to natural turbidity when you have storms and whatnot, and that it comes detached from the seabed. And if, you know, an excess of horsepower is a contributing factor to that, then I think we need to decide how we want to, you know, educate the people in the use of their boats. And I would be somebody who would have to also be subject to those considerations, because I go up and down that harbor for 400 hours a summer, and it's a lot of use, and I'm not standing on any kind of a soapbox about it. I think that we have to figure out why that eelgrass is coming loose, and then we have to fix it. But I think that there are a lot of people that I've come across in my daily activities that ask me about it. It's like, what's up with the eelgrass? Why is it all floating around? And again, it's that conversation that you start having with people, and then they start to ask questions and dig into it and be like, well, we don't want that, because we may like water skiing, but we also like eating bay scallops, and we also like sailing, and we also like clean water. It's funny, the global warming has its upside. I was just talking to somebody today who was like, yeah, well, we have bonito in the harbor almost 3 or 4 months of summer now. It's fantastic. And it's true. The species that we have in the harbor right now are attracting more attention and more interest, and frankly, more joy in people's pursuit of those things. So more and more people are seeing it and enjoying it, and probably, I would hope, wanting to protect it.
Right. Back to that observation, which is central to what we're talking about tonight. So thank you. Niles, what's giving you hope?
Hope, yeah. So in general, museums have been real energy hogs, particularly in the last 40, 50 years. And I'm talking primarily about art museums or museums that have big artifact collections, because they tend to have a very narrow window of allowed environmental conditions. So temperature and humidity have to be regulated very close, with, in some cases, a plus or minus 5 percentage point. So carbon footprints for museums have been tremendously bad. That's starting to change. I think museums have recognized that. And so when you go for a major museum, you're trying to borrow paintings, And in the past where you have said, okay, but it's got to be transported in a truck that the temperature and humidity are the same. It's got to be in a storage facility, temperature and humidity are, within this. In the gallery, it's got to be temperature. And this paralleled a rise in sort of these superstar architects building massive museums that for a while really weren't about how to display the artifacts in some ways or how those museums operated. That is also changing. So I think hand in hand with that, we're getting more LEED buildings, or architects are designing spaces with much more cognizance of around how does a building perform, how does it perform in a really important way. So to see those changes now where museums are lessening those restrictions a little bit, even going to plus or minus 10 can make a huge difference in terms of the the carbon footprint that a museum has. So I'm excited to see that change is one part of my answer to you. The other part I would say is the American Alliance of Museums did a study recently, and I think I have this right. It's kind of hard to believe, but there are more museums in the country than there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined.
Wow. Yeah.
And that counts. I don't know, it's just interesting, but I think that counts, from the very, very small all the way up. But the related and more important point, I think, is that they also did a study that said museums, even in this day and age, believe it or not, tend to be seen as trustworthy institutions and where you can go and get fairly objective, dare I say, truthful interpretation of what's going on. And to that end, museums really are starting to wade into discussion around climate change and doing it, and kind of as Jen and Sarah teed this up, not from the standpoint of wringing their hands over what are we going to do, but how do you talk about it? How do you introduce the topic to kids coming through the museum or your visitors? And how do you create programming around it that's seen, again, in a more trustworthy way? So I think together, those two things are
That's great.
are
Great
cause for
answer.
hope.
Thank you. Super. All right. Over to you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes. Wait.
We forgot to tell everyone that we're recording this, so if you do ask a question, please use the microphone. Thank you.
Niles, when you're thinking about restoring like that one wall, but I suppose that project's going to go on and on with other buildings and other walls, right? Where are you drawing the line? Like, I'm assuming that the subterranean material's not going to be historic anymore, right? So you're going to be bringing in polymers, whatever. It's something that's going to be sustainable, to the climate change. So is there discussion on where that ends, what you use, where is it not historic? Anyway, do you get?
Yep. Yeah, great question. I think that's sort of always evolving in terms of how we try to answer that question. And again, we try to do this from a holistic point of view. So we're not just looking at, in this case, the brick and the mortar, or in some cases, the Portland cement that had been put in, 40 years ago, which is really one of the issues that we're dealing with. Without getting hopefully too sidetracked here, mortar used to be the sacrificial element. And then when you started putting in new materials like Portland cement and concrete and other things that were tried over the years that didn't allow the moisture to breathe, that trapped it in there, the bricks then became the sacrificial element. So we're starting to lose that. So we're going to go back to some of the things that we did before that I think have shown to be more sustainable from a material standpoint. But I think, listening to Julie talk, one of the things that we really want to be mindful in that spot is the landscape and how the landscape interacts with the foundation, with what's below ground, looking at the stormwater runoff that's in that area. We flood in that location a lot. And so how can we better, create filtration? How can we better create a landscape that can deal with some of this flooding? Again, not only from the harbor, but from the stormwater and the groundwater that's rising and coming up from the foundation. So I think, again, holistically as possible, we want to try to think of this pretty carefully as we go, not only on this project, but all of them.
Great. Good question. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you. One of the things that when I first started coming to the island, I married into an island family. So when I first started coming to the island, they were talking a lot about the drinkable water from the springs and everything else. I'm also now hearing about storm water and storm runoff, particularly, I think now is when you're talking about it going down and ending up in the Pacific Club, and the fact that there's more water coming from the top of the island down than there may be coming from the ocean in. So where is this whole issue of drinkable water, water that's coming in from storms, and also when I hear about people talking about 1,000 more cars and the additional building that's going to take place, how is that all balancing out at this point in time in terms of what the island is trying to do, and is there a breaking point that we have to be concerned about?
I'm not sure I have all those answers, but I'll turn it over here. But it's a great question. I think a lot of us are, sharing that concern. I will just say that I had the opportunity to meet with some folks from both the stormwater and wastewater departments of the town, and there's some really exciting work going on right now that's going to lead to better mapping and better understanding of what, where the water's going, how the stormwater is flowing. That's where I get excited with the possibilities of public-private partnerships. If together we can try to figure out some of that data, better understand sort of the scenario that's happening to the stormwater and where it's going, and then respond accordingly. But the town is doing some really, really great stuff, particularly related to GIS and mapping and looking at some of those resources. But you guys probably have better thoughts than I do.
I'm going to put whoever was talking about bioswales back on into Sarah. Maybe you could talk a little bit about it, because I think one of the tricks up the sleeve for people who think about resilience on a regular basis is this really good question of how do we better manage the water that's coming up from the ground, that's coming down the hill, and that's coming from the ocean. And some of these bioswales and other nature-based solutions to hold the water is actually a really great way to answer it. So over to you, Sarah.
Sorry, this is the closest mic. I'm by no means an expert on this, but I will say the fact that you asked that question shows that we're doing a really good job as a community in talking about these issues and stormwater. I mean, stormwater is not really like the sexy issue of like stormwater runoff. Let's all know about it. But we're all interested. And now that you asked the question, everyone's like, what is the stormwater? And I think to Niles' point, I think that the current right now, the town is doing a lot of mapping, but I will say the bioswales that we have, and I think that the land bank has been putting a lot in terms of bioswales or improving wetlands, both freshwater and saltwater wetlands, to handle the stormwater runoff, especially. I think there's some really great work that was shown that the land bank's doing around Lily Pond Park that has lots of different stages of stormwater management. And so I think some of those presentations that are available online, but there's been a lot of information sessions that the land bank's been doing. And I think even if you're not personally invested in like the Lily Pond project per se, the lessons that you can learn by going to any of those presentations and learning about how the community input is really important into how the community uses those landscapes, but also that stage process of filtering water that's ultimately going into our harbors, I think is really important. And I don't know if anyone was here during the catastrophic sewer main break years ago. That's the first time I learned so much about how little we knew about our stormwater infrastructure, how so many of so much of our infrastructure was housed with our sewer lines and things. And so I think that, supporting the sewer department and David Gray in particular is also really good. And if you haven't had a tour with David Gray of the sewer facility, it's really, really fascinating about what goes into our sewer stormwater systems as well.
Did you want to add
I just
anything?
want to talk about that Lily Pond project for a second, because I think people may or may not understand what's going to happen there. And I haven't been in a lot of the info sessions, but I think the one thing to notice about Lily Pond, it is a non-functioning ecosystem due to invasive plants. And that used to be a pond. and it takes all of the roof water from the surrounding neighborhoods and it just gets stuck in there. And a long time ago, it used to flow through different, like, I guess they were bioswales, but they weren't made to the harbor and get cleaned that way by plants and different processes. But I would say that's going to be a really fascinating project. It's going to be a little ugly to start, but I think it could really help with the back to the drinking water, the storm water, all of that water being more properly filtered by plants that are native and important. And there will be a lot of Phragmites management, and I think it's going to be an exciting project.
Great. Thank you. Great question. Yes, Tobias.
I guess it's kind of for Julie and Niles. You've both been talking about, projects, that require, permitting, for whether they're buildings or the natural landscape. And I think it's, really one of the things I love about permitting is it's like looking out forward. So in the, next 10 years, we'll probably build another 1,000 homes on Nantucket. We average about 150 a year. And so I'd be curious to hear like what you're really excited about, maybe from like a public policy point of view, from like when those new homes get built, or, every year we replace about 500 roofs. You got 10,000 homes and you got to replace about, a roof every 20 years. That's about 500 roofs a year. What can we doing? We got a lot of black roofs. Can we be putting, white tiles on them, so that it's not as hot downtown? Or, what are some other permitting things you're excited about that maybe other places are doing that's going to make things, move forward in a planned, reasonable way?
Well, I'll start and I'll be brief, but I think our community would benefit looking at some other communities that have implemented monitoring of the plantings and the amount of turf grass that you put in relative size to the size of your house and your lot. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of regulation, but I do think on a small island with a fragile ecosystem that we could be a real model for how to, through the permitting process, show people how to choose something other than privet and turf grass, and that should be in a way considered as carefully as we consider the shutters or the door color perhaps on the house, that you wouldn't go to a pristine environment, say like in Cisco and the smooth hummocks, and clear your property corner to corner and put privet around it. And that would be somehow regulated by the permitting process. So I would like to see that. I'm not sure exactly how that happens, but I think that would be a really good thing for Nantucket to look at.
Yeah. Good answer.
Yeah, I agree. I think an exciting opportunity with knowing what we know now in terms of design, so you can, build gutter systems that are more adequate than what we've typically done. And I think part of that also gets at education for the contractors. So if we can help, I think there's a desire for people to want to do what's right for the most part. And so if we can help, with that training program, with understanding why this matters, I think that could go a long way. And I think there is some interest there for sure. I know, Tobias, you're, in terms of solar, seeing the solar progress on the island, I think is great personally. We're going to be doing a solar project with Tobias on our storage facility out on Bartlett Road. That's probably other than the Whaling Museum, probably our biggest energy hog, because we do keep the conditions there pretty regulated. So that's going to make a massive difference right off the bat. And so looking for opportunities along those lines, I think are really great. And then I guess lastly, one of the things that I think I'm most excited about, I thought I saw Mary Bergman here. Is Mary here? No? Okay. I know she's been behind this. A number of people are behind it. And I think it's really starting to grow. But this whole idea of salvage and reuse here on the island as it comes to building, to see that gain traction, and if we can help sort of looking at the building analysis of, well, you're throwing away perfectly good, whatever, oak, that's got an R value of this. And, if you can kind of build the economics behind that and show how that works, both from a preservation point of view, but from an economic point of view as well. And we're not paying to ship this stuff off island in trucks, on boats, on trucks. I mean, that carbon footprint's ridiculous. And so if we can make progress, to that end, and thinking about how we build and take advantage of some of these things that we now know, I'm pretty excited about that.
I am so glad you said that. That is another one of our Remain projects that we are super excited about. Salvage and reuse, I think, is just such an interesting way for us to not only impact the climate footprint, but also just understand, how we manage our own garbage, which I think, I happen to live across the street from the Nantucket dump, so I am really familiar with that. And I do take a trip to the drop off my garbage every Sunday. And if you don't do that, you should go from time to time, because how we manage our waste is just deeply interesting. So I think as a community, we could spend a little time thinking more about that. I think would go a long way to making sure that we are a greener, more sustainable, resilient community. So that's my point of view on that question. Thanks, Tobias. Anyone else? Another question? Yes. One more. This is it. Okay. Last question, by the way. Drum roll, please.
All right. Well, thank you guys all so much for speaking. This has been really insightful. I have a question for Julie. I was wondering if you could speak to some of the challenges you face specifically with planting native, whether it's like logistical or like pleasing your clients while also planting native.
That's kind of a tough one. I would say that planting natives is challenging because the promise of it being deer resistant and low maintenance and all of that stuff it's kind of far away when you start. And I would say that especially when dealing with clients with a more limited budget and you have to plant smaller plants and then fence them, and just the nursery industry, and that when natives come, they're very juiced up and they're full of fertilizer, and the deer are like, yeah. And that's not what they just chow them to the ground. So it is challenging. And actually, I'm going to tell a small anecdote about the Garden Club's project with the Salt Marsh Center. And I was helping the Garden Club and Paulette Bowling, do this native planting. And I said, I'll totally help you, but I'm not going to do it. I'll help you. And it was really hard for them and for me to watch, but it's kind of like when someone's learning to ride a bike and you have to take your hands off, and they did it. And you just have to keep planting, and you have to stay positive, and you have to cover the things from the bunnies till they grow up. And it is not for the faint of heart. But I would say if you have resources, the things that I would recommend to people, and you do have a faint heart and you don't want things to get eaten, is that you buy plants that are bigger than deer browse line. You cluster them in massive groups so that they are more resilient and the deer can't get in between them. So you plant really dense, and you kind of mimic nature, because you see deer browse in nature, but you don't notice it because there's so many plants. So you have to really do it in sections and phases and put a lot of plants at it, is what I would say.
Okay.
And try and get vendors that don't use as much fertilizer.
Well, thank you to everyone, and thank you to Cecil for your insightful questions, and thank you for your insightful questions. Yes, I said. Oh, and thank you all to our panelists for joining us today and all the insightful words that you shared with us. We want to remind everyone that as we adjourn here tonight, we're going to be going outside for a little cocktail reception, a little bit of light bites and continued conversation. So you can come and see any of us, or you can have a conversation with each other. Everyone wants to talk about stormwater and sewers. I know it. It's the hot topic of the day. We want to thank everyone for coming tonight. This QR code is different than the first one you saw. This one goes to a short survey about the Climate Summit tonight. but it also gives you an opportunity to hear what else you want to learn about. So we've had great success, really interested people that want to attend our summit. And so we want to hear who else you want to talk to, what other industries that you're interested in, and who you want to get together. Do you want to add anything?
That was really great, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks.
This will also be going out in an email to everyone that attended, so you can do the survey then or now. And we are also, as we said, recording this event. So it will be available through NCTV. We'll send out a YouTube link when we have it, so you can watch this in the future. But yeah, please tell us what else you guys are interested in learning about, hearing about, what else, if you want to talk to us about something as well. And thank you again to our sponsors who are up here on the screen. And please, our cocktail party is outside tonight because it's actually beautiful. Thank you. Climate change. So please join us outside. Everyone will be joining you out there. Thank you so much.